It was late one Saturday morning, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen. I was there, sipping my drink and scrolling absent-mindedly on my phone, waiting for my friend to show up. He and I had been planning to spend the day together just like countless weekends before. But that day was different, marked by a feeling I couldn't quite place. His mom, Lena, moved around the kitchen with an effortless grace, setting dishes on the counter and humming softly as she did. I'd known her for years. She was kind, warm, and always had a way of making you feel like family. But something about her today caught my attention in a way it hadn't before. Perhaps it was the way the morning light filtered in through the windows, casting a glow over her. Or maybe it was the hint of a soft smile when our eyes met, as if we both felt the subtle shift in the air. "Do you want another cup?" she asked, her voice light as she lifted the coffee pot. "Sure, thanks," I replied, holding my mug toward her. Our hands brushed briefly, and I felt a strange thrill at the simple contact. A small laugh escaped her, and I found myself smiling back, though I wasn't entirely sure why. The seconds felt a bit longer than they should, each one drawing out a slight tension I couldn't shake. It was as if we were both aware of something lingering between us, yet neither of us acknowledged it. For a moment, we stood in silence, only the soft clinking of dishes between us. The kitchen felt warmer, the sounds of the world outside fading into a quiet hum as we shared that simple, unspoken connection. The silence between us grew thicker with each passing second. I should have looked away, should have focused on my coffee, or found something else to talk about. But instead, my gaze lingered on her as she poured the coffee, watching the way her fingers held the pot with such calm precision. "Thank you," I said, voice softer than I intended. My eyes met hers again, and I felt that unspoken understanding ripple through the air. It was subtle, something unnoticeable to anyone else, but undeniably real to us. Lena set the pot down and gave me a smile, a knowing smile that held more than friendliness. "I'm glad you're here," she said quietly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "The house feels a bit empty sometimes." I nodded, feeling a tug in my chest. It was strange to hear her admit something so personal, so vulnerable. "I'm happy to help keep you company," I said, my words coming out in a way that felt more layered than I intended. The intensity of her gaze held me in place, and I knew she felt it too. As she turned back to the sink, I caught a glimpse of something I'd never noticed before, a delicate softness in her posture, an ease that drew me in. Every small movement felt like it held a secret, some unspoken invitation that I was only just beginning to understand. She reached for a dish, her sleeve slipping down slightly to reveal her wrist, graceful and elegant. It was ridiculous how such a small detail could be so captivating, but it was. Suddenly, the soft chime of her phone interrupted the moment, breaking the quiet tension. She glanced at it and sighed, muttering something under her breath. "It's just a reminder," she said, dismissing it, but I could sense a flicker of annoyance in her expression. "Everything okay?" I asked, genuinely curious. Lena hesitated, then shrugged. "Just life things. I try to keep busy, but, well, it's not always easy." I understood that feeling too well. Yeah, sometimes it's the little things that keep us going, right? She turned to face me again, her expression softening. "You're wiser than you look, you know that?" We both laughed, but as the laughter faded, the silence returned, heavier this time. Her hand lingered on the counter, and without thinking, I reached out, placing my hand next to hers. It was a small gesture, one that could easily be brushed off as friendly. But as our fingers brushed again, a spark leapt between us, undeniable. Lena's eyes met mine, widening slightly, and in that moment there was no mistaking the shift. She didn't pull away. Instead, she stayed, her gaze steady, her breathing just a touch quicker than before. A shiver ran down my spine, and I realized that we had reached a point of no return. For a second, I thought about pulling my hand away, making a joke to lighten the moment, anything to distract from the intensity between us. But I couldn't. My hand stayed there, my fingers just barely grazing hers, feeling the warmth of her skin. Lena's gaze softened, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "It's been nice having you around," she said quietly, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Her eyes held mine, and in that gaze I felt something shift, a flicker of vulnerability, a quiet longing that mirrored my own. I swallowed, trying to find something to say, anything that would match the gravity of the moment. "It's nice being here," I managed, my voice a little hoarse. "I didn't realize I didn't know you felt." My words trailed off, lost under the weight of what wasn't being said. I could feel my pulse quickening, each beat loud in the silence between us. She looked down at our hands, her fingers just barely touching mine, and I noticed the faint blush creeping up her cheeks. Her fingers trembled slightly, and she took a small step closer, closing the already small distance between us. I could feel her warmth, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the lingering smell of coffee in the air. "I should probably finish cleaning up," she said, but her voice was so quiet, so unconvincing that I knew it was an excuse. She didn't move away, didn't pull her hand back. Instead, she stayed, and the silence filled with an unspoken question, one that neither of us dared to answer out loud. Without thinking, I reached out, placing my hand gently on her shoulder, feeling the softness of her sweater beneath my fingers. Her breath hitched, her eyes widening as she looked up at me. "I don't want to make things complicated," she murmured, her voice tinged with uncertainty, but she didn't step back. "Me neither," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. My hand lingered on her shoulder, and I could feel the tension in her, the way she leaned into my touch despite herself. The kitchen felt smaller, the walls seeming to close in around us, making the moment feel intimate, as though the world outside had faded away, leaving just the two of us. She took a shaky breath, her gaze flickering down to my hand on her shoulder, then back up to meet my eyes. "This is probably not a good idea," she said, but her voice lacked conviction, her words more of a formality than an actual protest. Her eyes searched mine, as if looking for reassurance, for some sign that we weren't making a mistake. I took a step closer, feeling the warmth of her body, the subtle scent of her perfume. "We don't have to do anything," I said softly. "We can just be here." But even as I spoke, I knew the words were hollow. The tension between us was too thick, too electric to ignore. We had already crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone. Lena's hand reached up, hesitating for a moment before resting gently on my arm, her fingers warm and soft against my skin. "I don't know what's happening," she whispered, her eyes locked on mine, full of a mix of fear and desire. I didn't answer. Instead, I leaned in, closing the small distance between us, my breath mingling with hers. My hand slid from her shoulder to her cheek, brushing against her skin as I tilted her face up to mine. Her lips parted, her eyes wide and searching, and in that moment, everything else faded away: the questions, the uncertainty, the boundaries we should have respected. All that mattered was her, the feel of her skin beneath my fingertips, the warmth radiating from her, pulling me in. My heart hammered as I drew closer, my face mere inches from hers, the air between us charged with anticipation. Lena's eyes flickered between mine, her breath shallow and unsteady. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned in, her gaze softening, inviting, as though silently giving in to the magnetic pull that neither of us could resist. Our lips hovered, a hair's breadth apart, and I could feel the warmth of her breath, sweet and quick against my skin. My hand lingered on her cheek, fingers brushing lightly across her skin in a gesture that felt both comforting and electrifying. I could feel her hand on my arm, steadying herself as her gaze softened, and for a moment we just stood there, suspended in time, savoring the tension, the closeness. Then, slowly, as if in a trance, Lena tilted her face up, closing the gap between us. Her lips met mine, soft and tentative, a delicate touch that sent a surge of warmth through me. The kiss was gentle at first, like a question neither of us dared to fully answer, a tentative exploration of feelings that had been left unspoken for too long. But as the seconds passed, the hesitation faded, replaced by a depth of emotion that neither of us had anticipated. Her hand slid from my arm, moving up to rest on my shoulder, and I felt her fingers press gently into my skin as she leaned in, her body relaxing into the embrace. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her closer, feeling the heat radiate between us as we surrendered to the moment. Every part of me was acutely aware of her warmth, her scent, the way her breath hitched softly as our kiss deepened. It was as if all the boundaries, all the unspoken rules that should have kept us apart, dissolved in that instant. The kitchen, once a familiar and mundane space, transformed into something intimate, sacred, as if it had always been meant for this moment. Every sound around us faded away, leaving only the soft rustle of our movements, the whispered breaths between us as we clung to each other, lost in the intensity of our connection. As the kiss grew deeper, more intense, Lena's fingers tangled in the fabric of my shirt, pulling me closer, as though afraid to let go. I could feel the pulse of her heartbeat, fast and strong, mirroring my own. Her touch was warm, grounding, yet there was a vulnerability in it, a quiet plea that made my heart ache. This wasn't just a moment of impulse, it was something deeper, something neither of us could fully explain. We broke apart slowly, reluctantly, our foreheads resting against each other as we caught our breath. Her eyes searched mine, filled with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty, as if she too was trying to understand the depth of what had just happened. I don't know what this means," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, barely more than a breath. I reached up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, my thumb brushing gently along her cheek. "Maybe it doesn't have to mean anything, or maybe it means everything," I murmured, my voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling within me. Lena's gaze softened, and I felt her lean into my touch, her eyes closing briefly as if savoring the moment. "It's just, I haven't felt this way in a long time," she admitted, her voice barely audible. There was a vulnerability in her words that tugged at something deep within me, a quiet confession that spoke of loneliness, of a longing that had been buried beneath the surface for too long. I understood that feeling more than I cared to admit. "Me neither," I whispered, my fingers tracing gentle patterns on her back as I held her close. We stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, letting the silence speak for us, the weight of unspoken emotions lingering in the air, filling the space between us. Neither of us moved to break the embrace. It was as though we were suspended in time, caught in a moment that neither of us wanted to end. The warmth of her body against mine, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the softness of her touch, it was all so real, so grounding yet surreal in the same breath. The world outside seemed distant, irrelevant, as though it no longer mattered. All that existed was her, the feel of her skin, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as we held each other close. And as the minutes ticked by, I knew that this was a moment I would never forget, a line that could never be uncrossed, a connection that would linger long after the moment had passed. As we stood there, wrapped in each other's warmth, I could feel Lena's breathing slow, becoming more measured, as if she was finally letting herself relax in my arms. Her fingers lingered on my shoulder, tracing light patterns that sent tingles down my spine. There was something incredibly tender in the way she held me, a softness that made the moment feel all the more intimate. Slowly, Lena pulled back, her hand drifting from my shoulder to my chest, where it rested for a moment, as if feeling the beat of my heart beneath her palm. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and in them, I saw a mixture of hesitation and undeniable affection. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, as though grappling with words she wasn't ready to say. "I don't want to make things difficult," she whispered, her voice a blend of worry and longing. She took a shaky breath, her fingers tightening slightly on my shirt. "But I also don't want to pretend this doesn't mean something." I nodded, my hand still resting gently on her waist. "Me neither," I said quietly, my gaze unwavering. "But I don't want you to feel like you have to choose or change anything." She let out a soft, almost relieved laugh, and her face softened. "You always know what to say," she murmured, her fingers tracing along the fabric of my shirt absently. The familiar surroundings of the kitchen now felt different, infused with an energy that was entirely new. The sunlight filtering through the window cast a warm glow over her, illuminating the subtle lines on her face, the gentle curve of her smile. "I guess I should probably finish tidying up," she said softly, her hand slipping from my chest. There was a reluctance in the movement, as though part of her didn't want to step away. She glanced at the sink, then back at me, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "But if you'd like to stay, maybe have some more coffee, I'd be happy for the company." I smiled, nodding, grateful for the invitation. "I'd like that," I replied, feeling a renewed sense of comfort in her presence, a quiet joy that seemed to linger in the air. We spent the next hour in the kitchen, talking about everything and nothing, our conversation flowing naturally, easily. Every now and then our hands would brush, our eyes meeting over the rim of our coffee mugs, and I could feel the connection between us deepen with each passing moment. She'd laugh softly, her cheeks flushed, and I'd find myself captivated by the small details, the curve of her smile, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke about her passions. At some point, without even thinking, I reached across the counter, taking her hand in mine. She looked down at our joined hands, then back up at me, her expression soft, almost shy. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "for making me feel seen." I squeezed her hand gently, feeling a warmth spread through me. "You deserve to be seen," I replied, my voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even me. I'm just glad I get to be the one who does. Her eyes held mine, and I could see the emotions swirling within her: gratitude, affection, a quiet kind of yearning that felt both fragile and profound. We stood there, our hands entwined, the world around us fading into a quiet hum, leaving only the two of us in the warmth of the moment. Eventually, the reality of the world outside began to creep back in, a reminder that this moment, as perfect as it was, couldn't last forever. But as she looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of happiness and sadness, I knew that this connection, this quiet bond we had shared, would stay with us long after the moment had passed. Finally, Lena took a deep breath, her gaze softening as she gave my hand one last squeeze. "Thank you," she said again, her voice gentle, and I knew that even though we were letting go, this was only the beginning of something new, something real, something that would linger between us, quietly and profoundly.